He survived being shot. He survived being paralyzed. He survived murder charges, federal investigations, and years of law enforcement pressure that took down everyone around him. On Chicago's West Side, Labar Spann, known as Bro Man, was the kind of figure that seemed untouchable. But according to federal prosecutors, while he was dodging convictions in court, bodies were allegedly dropping across the city, and the code he lived by had one brutal rule: suspected snitches didn't get warnings. By the time Labar Spann, better known around the West Side as Bro Man, was making a name for himself, he had already become a fixture on the 3900 block of West Lexington Street. That stretch of pavement wasn't just where he grew up. It was the heart of his organization's drug operation. According to authorities, Spann treated the block like sacred ground, carrying an attitude that made it clear where his loyalty started and ended. His ties to the Four Corner hustlers stretched back to the mid-1990s. As a teenager, he worked security for older members before steadily climbing through the ranks. Over time, the gang expanded its reach across West Garfield Park and Humboldt Park, eventually pushing into the old LeClaire Courts housing development on Chicago's southwest side. Violence followed Spann almost everywhere he went. Two of his brothers were murdered. He survived multiple attempts on his own life. In 1999, a shooting left him paralyzed from the waist down. Most people would have seen that as the end of the road. For Spann, it became another chapter in the story. Just 4 years later, he survived another shooting. Several of the people closest to him were killed over the years, including one associate he often referred to as his legs. Still, being confined to a wheelchair never slowed his ambitions. If anything, it seemed to hearten his outlook. He understood the dangers of the streets and believed survival depended on staying alert every second of the day. After the 1999 shooting, authorities say Spann took control of his faction of the Four Corner hustlers and began building a reputation for ruthless retaliation. According to federal prosecutors, the violence tied to him escalated dramatically after he was paralyzed. Believing he knew who was responsible for the attack, Spann allegedly ordered a hit in response. Investigators say that over the next several years, multiple killings were carried out under his direction. By 2003, law enforcement suspected Spann's crew of being connected to at least 16 murders, but murder wasn't the only tool they allegedly used. Prosecutors say the crew built its power through extortion, robbery, drug trafficking, and intimidation. Dealers working certain corners were sometimes forced to pay a street tax just to operate. Other times, drugs were allegedly stolen and then sold back through the organization's own network. Witnesses and victims were often too scared to cooperate with police. The operation itself was organized and calculated. Authorities say members monitored police activity with scanners, maintained security teams, conducted surveillance on targets, and frequently used rental cars to avoid detection. This wasn't a crew moving recklessly. It was one that allegedly treated crime like a business. By the early 2010s, Spann was already one of the most heavily watched figures on Chicago's West Side. Local and federal investigators had spent years trying to build cases around him. Rival gangs wanted him gone. Law enforcement wanted him behind bars. Yet somehow, he kept slipping through the cracks. Then came a mistake that would eventually help bring everything crashing down. In 2015, federal investigators focused on a visit Spann made to a gun range in the southwest suburbs. As a convicted felon, he wasn't legally allowed to possess or handle firearms. But according to prosecutors, after visiting a shooting range in Lyons, he went straight to social media and started showing off. Videos posted online allegedly showed activity inside the range, while gunfire echoed in the background. Investigators later said Spann arrived with two women, one of whom rented a Glock handgun. Authorities claimed Spann loaded the weapon and participated in the shooting session. For a man who had spent years avoiding major convictions, posting evidence online turned out to be a costly decision. The legal pressure continued building. In 2017, Spann pleaded guilty to weapons and narcotics offenses after prosecutors accused him of pressuring a co-defendant to lie before a federal grand jury. He also admitted guilt to armed robbery and witness tampering charges. Yet, despite spending years in custody and repeatedly finding himself at the center of major investigations, Spann still managed to avoid murder convictions in state court. That changed when federal prosecutors brought a sweeping racketeering case against him. A federal jury ultimately convicted Spann in a massive conspiracy case that tied him and his crew to multiple murders, including the killings of rival gang leaders. The indictment painted a picture of an organization that used fear, violence, and intimidation to dominate parts of Chicago's West Side drug trade for nearly 2 decades. Several co-defendants were charged alongside him, but one by one, they accepted plea deals before trial. Spann chose a different path. He took the stand in his own defense and denied involvement in the killings. While admitting to committing robberies, he maintained that he had distanced himself from gang life years earlier and insisted his reputation alone was enough to explain why people continued associating him with the organization. Federal prosecutors saw it very differently. They argued that the evidence showed a clear chain of command and placed Spann firmly at the top. To them, he wasn't a small-time hustler or an ordinary street criminal. He was the leader of a criminal enterprise that used violence, fear, and loyalty to maintain power for years. His defense team pushed back hard, arguing that the government's case leaned heavily on witnesses with lengthy criminal records and plenty of reasons to cooperate. According to the defense, many of those witnesses were saying whatever they thought prosecutors wanted to hear in hopes of helping themselves. But as dramatic as those arguments were, the most explosive part of the case was still ahead. Now, Storino and the prosecution had a huge challenge on their hands. Their entire case rested on convincing the jury that Labar Span was the man pulling the strings behind 3 separate murders that took place in 2000. The first case centered on Carlos Caldwell, who was gunned down on January 19th, and this one came with a lot of history. Just 6 months earlier, Span had allegedly tried to rob Caldwell, but the robbery didn't go according to plan. Caldwell fought back and shot Span in the chest. That shooting left Span permanently paralyzed from the waist down. According to prosecutors, Span never forgot it. They argued that he ordered one of his trusted associates, Sammy Booker, to get revenge. Booker would later cooperate with federal authorities and become a key witness. Still, when everything was laid out in court, jurors ultimately decided there wasn't enough evidence to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Span had actually ordered Caldwell's murder. The second killing involved Maximilian McDaniel, who was murdered on July 25th. Authorities claim McDaniel had become a target because he was cooperating with law enforcement. What made the situation even more personal was the fact that he was reportedly helping prosecutors in a murder case involving Span's father, a high-ranking member of the Black Souls street gang. Once again, investigators pointed to Booker as the gunman. Then there was Lavar Smith, who was killed on April 16th. Unlike the other cases, this one was all about gang politics and territory. Smith belonged to a rival faction of the Four Corner Hustlers, making him an enemy by default. According to testimony, Booker and another associate spent the entire night watching Smith's home. They waited patiently until the next morning. The moment Smith stepped outside and climbed into his car to head to work, they struck. But just like the Caldwell case, prosecutors couldn't fully connect Span to the murder in the eyes of the jury. Once again, he avoided a conviction. Then came 2003, a year that prosecutors described as especially bloody. Authorities tied Spann to 3 more killings, starting with the murder of George King on April 8th. King was a street-level dealer, but according to investigators, he wasn't the real target. Prosecutors claimed Spann's enforcers, Tremaine Thompson and Ju-Woon Foster, killed King as part of a larger effort to lure out a more powerful gang figure that Spann was feuding with. Only 8 days later, on April 16th, Thompson and Foster allegedly struck again. This time, the victim was Willie Foots Woods, a respected Black Souls leader. Authorities said Woods had been threatening the business interests of a major West Side trafficker who supplied drugs to Spann's operation. That made him a problem that someone wanted removed. But the biggest murder case of all involved Rudy Rangel. Out of all 6 killings tied to Spann, this was easily the most high profile. Rangel wasn't just another street figure. He was a well-known Latin Kings leader who had grown up alongside Pedro and Margarito Flores, the infamous Flores twins who later became major drug traffickers connected to El Chapo and the Sinaloa cartel. But Rangel lived 2 lives. In one world, he was tied to Chicago's criminal underworld. In the other, he was a husband, a father, and an entrepreneur trying to make moves in the music industry. He had relationships with major rap artists like Fat Joe and DMX, and had even launched his own label, Dinero Records. After his death, DMX would later honor him with a tribute song titled Ayokato. Still, Rangel's flashy lifestyle attracted attention. He wore expensive jewelry, moved around with money, and traveled with a bodyguard. People noticed, then the rumors started spreading. According to police reports, word hit the streets that Rangel had stolen 150 kilos of cocaine, roughly 330 pounds. Whether the rumor was true or not almost didn't matter. Once it got around, a price was allegedly put on his head. The number floating around was staggering, $200,000. Authorities said that news eventually reached Spann. On June 4, 2003, Rangel was sitting inside a makeshift barbershop trailer near Roosevelt in Sacramento. It seemed like a normal day. His back was turned toward the entrance while everyone inside watched Game 1 of the NBA Finals between the Spurs and Nets. Nobody was paying attention to the door. Meanwhile, Donald "Squeaky" Simmons was making his way through a nearby alley carrying a handgun. Moments later, he stepped inside and opened fire. Rangel was killed on the spot. His bodyguard and the barber were also wounded during the attack. Then, Simmons disappeared into the night. What made the shooting even stranger was what he left behind. Rangel was wearing jewelry worth well over $200,000, but none of it was taken. According to prosecutors, the shooting was initially believed to be a robbery gone wrong. Investigators claimed Spann, Martise Nunnery, and another associate helped set everything up. Police reports alleged that Spann and Nunnery drove Simmons to the location and supplied the murder weapon before the attack. But the story didn't end there. After Rangel's death, his widow, who happened to be the daughter of a Chicago police officer, eventually became involved with Margarito Flores. She later fled to Mexico and spent time living inside a heavily fortified Sinaloa cartel compound. Years later, she co-authored a book called Cartel Wives alongside Pedro Flores' wife, detailing their experiences living around the cartel world. As for the Flores twins themselves, they would eventually become government witnesses whose testimony played a major role in helping authorities bring down El Chapo. Ironically, their wives later faced legal trouble of their own after being accused of laundering drug money connected to the twins' trafficking operation. Back in Chicago, prosecutors moved quickly. Spann, Nunnery, Simmons, and lookout John Coleman were all charged with Rangel's murder. Most of the defendants were eventually convicted. Spann, however, chose a bench trial, placing his fate in the hands of a judge instead of a jury. To build their case, investigators leaned heavily on undercover recordings gathered through a cooperating informant. The informant was a West Side drug dealer who had unusual access to multiple rival gangs and crews, allowing him to move freely between groups. When Spann eventually testified, he denied having any role in Rangel's killing or any of the other murders prosecutors tried to pin on him. His explanation was simple. He claimed he knew he was being recorded the entire time and intentionally fed the informant false information. According to Spann, he was simply playing a game and putting the cooperator to sleep with fake stories. Neither investigators nor many people on the streets bought that explanation. According to a high-ranking West Side gang member later interviewed by police, Spann never really stopped running things while locked up. Detective notes from a later federal prison interview painted an even wilder picture. The source described an internal war that erupted among four-corner hustler factions over territory and respect. Even from behind bars, Spann was allegedly still giving direction. The informant claimed he personally spoke with Spann while he was in jail, and according to that account, Spann's message was straightforward: don't back down. In fact, authorities didn't believe he was trying to calm the conflict at all. Instead, they argued that he was helping keep it alive, allegedly issuing orders from behind bars and fueling a war that continued to rage on the streets even after he was locked away. Despite those allegations, prosecutors were unable to secure a conviction. In the end, he was acquitted and walked out of Cook County Jail in 2009. Now, even after Spann walked out of jail in 2009, law enforcement never took their eyes off him. If anything, the spotlight only got brighter. The very next year, former Chicago Police Superintendent Jody Weiss called a high-profile meeting at the Golden Dome in Garfield Park. Sitting in that room were some of the city's top law enforcement officials and some of Chicago's most influential gang figures, including Spann. The message from authorities was simple: group responsibility. Weiss and his team made it clear that if one member of a crew committed violence, the entire organization could end up feeling the consequences. They also warned everyone about a tool federal prosecutors had used to dismantle organized crime for decades: RICO. The warning would end up sounding almost prophetic years later. But once the meeting ended, Spann wasn't impressed. He later claimed his parole officer had essentially tricked him into attending. To him, the whole thing felt more like a publicity stunt than a genuine attempt to stop violence. In his eyes, authorities were looking for excuses to lock people up for crimes they hadn't committed. Over the years, countless local and federal investigators spent time digging into Spann's activities. Ironically, two of the officers who helped investigate him would eventually end up in federal prison themselves. One of them was former Chicago police officer Jerome Finnegan. Police records show Finnegan was involved in Spann's first major murder case back in 1996. At the time, Spann was part of the Gordy's faction of the Four Corner Hustlers. The trouble started after Spann allegedly assaulted a woman, creating tension with a nearby faction of the unknown Vice Lords because one of their members was related to her. Leaders from both sides tried to calm things down through a meeting, but nothing got resolved. Instead, according to investigators, Spann and two other Four Corner Hustlers positioned themselves near Lexington and Springfield and waited for members of the Vice Lords to drive through. When the vehicle appeared, gunfire erupted. None of the intended targets were struck, but in the chaos, the driver lost control and crashed into Wayne Lucas, a 31-year-old city subcontractor who was laying asphalt nearby. Lucas, a father of 5, was rushed to the hospital but later died from his injuries. Spann was ultimately acquitted. His two co-defendants, however, were convicted and received lengthy prison sentences. Years later, Finnegan's own career came crashing down. Federal prosecutors exposed him as the leader of a corrupt crew of officers accused of stealing money from drug dealers and ordinary citizens alike. In 2011, he was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to tax evasion and involvement in a murder-for-hire scheme. The connection between Finnegan and Spann's family didn't end there. A few years after the Lucas case, Spann's younger half-brother Michael was arrested on North Avers, a block authorities believed had ties to Spann's operation. What happened afterward shocked even veteran observers. Finnegan and another officer, Timothy McDermott, posed for a photograph holding hunting rifles over Michael Spann while he lay on the floor with deer antlers placed on his head. The image looked less like police work and more like a hunting trophy display. When the photo surfaced years later, many viewed it as a disturbing symbol of unchecked police misconduct. Michael Spann's father believed the message was directed at Labar Span himself. Around the neighborhood, officers involved in those kinds of incidents had earned a reputation as beat-down boys, cops who operated however they wanted. Tragically, Michael Spann would later be killed in a drive-by shooting in 2007 on that same stretch of North Avers. Then there was Xavier Elizondo. Before becoming a convicted felon himself, Elizondo played a major role in the long-running investigation into Spann. Between late 2012 and early 2013, he submitted multiple affidavits that allowed investigators to wiretap several phones linked to Spann's organization. Those documents painted a picture of just how long authorities had been chasing him. One affidavit referenced Operation 5K, a joint investigation launched in 2003 involving the Chicago Police Department, the DEA, and the ATF. The operation focused on Spann and the Four Corner Hustlers, particularly their suspected involvement in 16 separate homicides. But investigators kept running into the same wall. People were willing to talk behind closed doors, but very few were willing to testify publicly. According to investigators, fear ruled the streets. Witnesses believed cooperating openly could put their lives at risk. Things became especially messy in 2018 when federal prosecutors found themselves in a strange position. At the same time they were charging Elizondo for lying in one case, they were also relying on evidence gathered through investigations he helped conduct. Eventually, Judge Thomas Durkin ruled that the wiretap evidence could still be used. For prosecutors, that decision was huge. Those wiretaps helped explain how Spann's organization allegedly made money for years. It wasn't just drug trafficking and robberies. Investigators claimed other drug crews actually hired Spann's people as muscle. According to law enforcement, if a dealer wanted control of a lucrative drug spot, they could allegedly call on Spann's crew to remove whoever was standing in the way. If rival organizations were battling over territory, authorities believed Spann's people could be brought in to settle the dispute through intimidation and violence. One veteran Chicago officer, familiar with the West Side drug trade, described the arrangement as unusual but effective. Most traffickers didn't like working with stick-up crews because they often robbed everyone involved. But using those same crews against rivals was a different story. And according to investigators, that reputation is exactly what made Spann such a powerful figure for so many years. While other crews focused on selling drugs, authorities believe Spann built an entire business around being the guy people called when they wanted problems handled, and handled permanently. By November 2021, the federal government finally got the conviction it had been chasing for years. A federal jury found Labar Spann guilty on major racketeering charges, accepting the prosecution's argument that he had spent roughly 2 decades directing a violent criminal enterprise built on robberies, extortion, and murder. This wasn't some quick courtroom victory either. The trial stretched across 8 long weeks. Jurors listened to testimony, reviewed mountains of evidence, and heard detailed accounts of violence that prosecutors said traced directly back to Spann and the Four Corner Hustlers. When closing arguments were finally over, The jury spent about 15 hours deliberating across 3 days before returning its verdict. During the trial, prosecutors painted Spann as the man sitting at the very top of the organization. Witness after witness took the stand describing how the gang allegedly operated. In total, 18 witnesses testified against him. Some of the most damaging testimony came from former associates and trusted members of the organization who had flipped and agreed to cooperate with federal authorities in hopes of reducing their own prison sentences. Jurors heard graphic allegations involving 6 separate murders listed in the indictment, but the government didn't win every battle. The jury concluded prosecutors failed to prove Spann's involvement in 2 of those killings beyond a reasonable doubt. Even so, the conviction was a major moment. Spann himself had openly embraced the image of an old-school gangster throughout much of his life. Bringing down someone federal prosecutors described as a longtime gang boss was viewed as one of the most significant gang-related convictions in Chicago since the Hobos gang leadership was convicted years earlier. When the verdict was read, Spann showed almost no reaction. Sitting in his wheelchair with a blanket pulled over his head, he remained expressionless as Judge Thomas Durkin announced the jury's decision. Across the courthouse, federal officials watched closely as years of investigation finally appeared to pay off. But the story didn't end there. More than 3 years after that conviction, Spann was suddenly granted a new trial, and the reason shook the entire case. At the center of the controversy was one of the government's most important witnesses, Sammy Booker, a former Four Corner Hustlers hitman who had been cooperating with authorities since 2012. Booker testified about robberies, extortion schemes, drug trafficking, attempted murders, and several killings tied directly to the government's case. While testifying, Booker told jurors his cooperation agreement called for prosecutors to recommend a sentence somewhere between 25 and 35 years. Later, however, information surfaced suggesting that former Assistant U.S. Attorney Peter Salib had privately assured Booker he would specifically recommend 25 years, eliminating the higher end of that range. According to court filings, the alleged promise happened years earlier when Booker was reportedly hesitant about cooperating before a grand jury. Defense attorneys argued that prosecutors were under pressure because the grand jury's term was about to expire and Booker was reluctant to testify about certain crimes. The alleged agreement supposedly involved a private understanding between Booker and the prosecutor. Yet, that arrangement never surfaced during later court proceedings. In fact, during Booker's 2019 plea hearing, the official agreement presented to the court still reflected the 25 to 35 year recommendation. When questioned about whether any other promises existed, both Booker and the prosecutor indicated there were none. When details about the alleged side agreement eventually surfaced years later, Judge Durkin openly expressed concern. He questioned why attorneys who knew about the arrangement had allowed the official record to remain unchanged for so long. That revelation set the stage for a second federal trial in 2025. As the retrial began, prosecutors immediately addressed the image sitting in front of the jury. Spann had been confined to a wheelchair since being paralyzed during a 1999 shooting. Federal prosecutors acknowledged that he might not fit the stereotype many people associate with a gang leader or murderer, but they argued appearances could be deceiving. According to the government, Spann didn't need physical mobility to maintain power. Prosecutors portrayed him as a calculating figure who built influence through intimidation, loyalty, and strategic violence. They argued he spent years directing others to carry out crimes on his behalf. The defense took the opposite approach. Spann's attorneys told jurors that their client lived in an extremely dangerous world where projecting strength could mean the difference between survival and becoming a target. They argued he deliberately cultivated a fearsome reputation, sometimes exaggerating his own importance and claiming responsibility for events he had nothing to do with simply to protect himself. The defense also attacked the credibility of government witnesses, pointing out that many had powerful incentives to testify against Spann, including reduced prison sentences and favorable treatment from prosecutors. According to the defense, jurors needed to consider whether these witnesses were telling the truth or simply saying whatever was necessary to save themselves. Prosecutors pushed back hard. They argued the Four Corner hustlers thrived on fear, power, and street status, and they described Spann as a respected leader whose orders carried weight throughout Chicago's West Side. After 6 weeks of testimony, arguments, and evidence, the case went to the jury. This time, the decision came quickly. Jurors deliberated for only about 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts across the board. Spann was convicted of racketeering conspiracy, extortion, and multiple murders connected to the criminal enterprise. With the convictions secured, the focus shifted to sentencing. Federal prosecutors argued that a life sentence was the only appropriate outcome. They described years of violence that left victims ranging from rivals and informants to innocent bystanders. According to the government, the damage extended far beyond individual victims and left lasting trauma throughout entire communities. Spann's lawyers acknowledged the seriousness of the crimes while presenting evidence about his difficult upbringing. They described neighborhoods overwhelmed by crime and poverty. They also pointed out that when Spann first entered federal custody, he struggled with reading, but later taught himself and began studying complex legal materials. Even the defense ultimately conceded the irreversible harm caused by the murders. Before sentencing, Spann addressed the court for roughly 15 minutes. He fiercely criticized federal prosecutors, accusing them of relying on unreliable witnesses and making secret deals behind the scenes. He insisted he was innocent and denied being part of the Four Corner hustlers at all. Despite facing life in prison, Spann showed little sign of fear. He maintained that he intended to keep fighting through appeals and predicted the legal battle was far from over. Judge Durkin wasn't persuaded. When the time came, he imposed a life sentence. The judge said the punishment brought him no satisfaction, but explained that the evidence convinced him Spann remained a dangerous individual whose influence over others had fueled years of violence. He pointed to lives lost, families shattered, and neighborhoods damaged by the crimes tied to the organization. Throughout the hearing, Spann continued insisting he stood alone and wasn't part of any gang. The judge responded by reminding him that many jurisdictions would have considered pursuing the death penalty for crimes of that magnitude. Instead, he focused on what he viewed as the senseless nature of the violence, arguing that all the bloodshed ultimately accomplished very little beyond building a reputation on the streets. In the end, Judge Durkin made his position clear. He believed Spann's influence, charisma, and ability to command loyalty made him a continuing threat. For that reason, the court concluded that he would spend the rest of his life behind bars.